All right, so much art history and never enough time to cover it all. So let's go run through the art museum. Our next chapter is chapter 27. So, as a reminder, write the page number that we start this chapter on in your table of contents. Up in the header, I want you to write the title of this chapter. You can either write chapter 27, you can write 27, or you can write 19th century art. This is a reminder, 5 hand-drawn sketches per chapter. Just a recap of what we've been looking at lately or this semester. With the 16th century, that's the Cinquecento Italian Renaissance, and also Northern Renaissance. But we had Renaissance over here. Then we looked at Baroque art. And then we looked at the Rococo, and we ended the 1700s, or we ended the 18th century with revolution in France with the neoclassical era. So that kind of sets us up for big changes in the 19th century. And those changes are technological, governmental, and social changes. All right, so think about it. Like for thousands of years, the way to get around, the way to travel from one point to another is either to walk or by some sort of a horse or even, on a boat. But transportation hasn't changed much in thousands of years. So from thousands of years ago up until 1800, transportation hasn't changed much. But within the next 100 years, people are going to be taking trains and cars and planes. And so there's going to be huge changes, with the next 100 to 120 years. Think about communication. How long does it take to get a communication? Like when you want to communicate with somebody that is far away, how long will it take for your letter to get there? Because there's no phones, there's no internet, there's not even any pagers, all right, which is before your time. But anyway, so you had to send a letter, and that letter goes by horse or it goes by ship. And it could be that, it takes days to get there, it takes weeks to get there, it even takes months for your communication to get where it's going. All right. And so that has been the standard of communication for thousands of years up to the 1800s. But between 1800 and 1900, we have this huge change in communication. You can communicate instantly with people that are a long distance away through the telegraph and then even the telephone. Another big change that has happened is that for thousands of years, the main system of government has been kings and queens or emperors. For thousands of years, most governments in the world have been based on a monarchy. But within 100 years, we're going to have the democracies rise up and even Marxism and communism rise up. So we have a huge change in governments, government styles come up. For thousands of years, most people have lived an agrarian lifestyle. Most people are involved with planting fields and harvesting crops so that people can eat. And that's been the major lifestyle for most people for thousands of years. Nothing's really changed. But between 1800 and 1900, we have the Industrial Revolution, and people move from this agrarian rural lifestyle into the cities, and they get jobs in factories. And they have this, and I have the photograph in the lower right, people living in a city at that time. So major changes happening with where people live. Another huge change is that for thousands of years, almost everything that is made has been made by a person's hand. We have this guy who's a cobbler, and he's making shoes. And this one guy in his little shop makes shoes, and that's where you get your shoes from. But then we have these factories, you go from your shoes being made by one guy to your shoes being made by a factory. And so, how this affects art, there's huge changes in art as well. So, for thousands of years, artists have basically worked with the same rules of painting and sculpture, is to make things look realistic. And so we have this painting on the left, which is I think late Egyptian and early Roman, but it follows the same rules of making it look realistic. And up until 1800s, they're all following the same rules of art. But within 100 years, we have this major shift in art where we go into modernism. Artwork looks very, very different within the next 100 years. So we're going to see a lot of major changes happening right after each other. Like I said, there's lots of changes ahead, and I was watching an art historian talk about how exciting all these changes are. That's what he loves. And one of my favorite periods is modern art, which is it'll be Unit 4. And one of the things that I like most about it, it's almost like fireworks going off. Let's take the Egyptians, like the Egyptian art, nothing changed for 3,000 years. And then we take this little selection of modern art between 1900 and even like 1960, and we just have one change after another within 60 years. And there's so many different things going on. It's like fireworks going off. So these changes are deep and permanent, and they will alter the world as have never been seen before. And the art of the period is fascinating. So many deep and significant rapid changes in art. And art is going to reflect those rapid changes that are happening in history. So we're going to start this era by finishing our neoclassical art. But neoclassicism changes under Napoleon. So we're going to be looking at art under Napoleon for a little bit. All right, so we are in France. We're going to focus on France for a little bit. And so France, the borders of France are a little bit different than what we know now, but basically it's kind of the same. So we're looking at France here. And the reason why we're going to focus on France is that it is the most powerful nation in Europe at this time. But France is in turmoil. All right, so we left off with the French Revolution, last unit. And it changed the face of modern politics across Europe and the world. It overturned the monarchy as government, and it introduced ideas of liberty and equality and human and civil rights. And it ushered in a world where people saw themselves as members of a community instead of the subjects of a king. But also during this time, there's a lot of food shortages, high taxes to pay for Louis XVI, and who had made massive debts. Louis XVI charged high taxes in order to pay for his debts. He was mismanaging the money, and he was making the nation go broke. So in order to make that money back, he was charging everybody else more to pay in taxes. So there are several political events. The Louis XVI stationed troops around Paris, and it sparked anger in people, and they stormed the Bastille, which is a significant event in the French Revolution. And in the end, absolutionist authoritarian government was replaced by an absolutist authoritarian government. They got rid of an authoritarian government and replaced it with an authoritarian government. But just one was a monarchy and the other one was not. All right, the new government was just as bad as the old government. And during this time, we had the Reign of Terror. So anybody that was an aristocrat was sent to execution by a guillotine. Lots and lots of people lost their lives to the guillotine. It was a really horrific time. The new government was so fanatical that if you were not as fanatical as them, you were seen as the enemy of the state, and that even if you were on their side, but you didn't believe in like how far they were going, you were in danger of being arrested and executed. So it was a really horrible time in French history. Anyways, we ended up last semester with this neoclassicism, but this neoclassicism that we looked at was mostly about the revolution. It was about democracy. And the neoclassicism that we're going to, this should say neoclassicism part two, is mostly about the empire. So after Napoleon comes to power, neoclassicism is all about the empire. All right, so then let's talk a little bit about Napoleon. Napoleon is an artillery commander during the revolution, and in a couple of skirmishes, he showed himself to be a total badass. He was able to stave off the royalists from storming the new government. So he and his artillery did an amazing job, and so he rose up through the ranks. And this is where we get the first French Republic. So this is the new government. But there was a problem with Napoleon. So he was a military genius, which was good. His army fighting for the French government was a little bit too good, and it was so good that it was scary. Napoleon was ruthless, he was competent, but he was ambitious. And he did some amazing things that the army hadn't been able to do before. But he started saying like crazy things. For example, he began to compare himself to Caesar, and he compared himself to Alexander the Great, and he compared himself to Octavian, the Roman emperor. And so that made the new French government kind of scared of Napoleon. So one of the ideas that Napoleon comes up with is that he thinks that it would be a good idea to invade Egypt. And the new government thinks that's a good idea because that'll get him away from France for a while, and he might even die in the battle. So he goes to Egypt, and I think his campaign lasts like 3 years, and it's a rough campaign, but you get a lot of these romantic images of these Europeans in a foreign land. Like I said, Egypt is a foreign land to France. These paintings represent the romantic view of the Napoleon in Egypt. But really, Napoleon had a very difficult time in Egypt, and he was defeated in Egypt. He returns home after his Egyptian campaign. He rises up through the ranks of the army, and he joins a group to overthrow the government. So that fear that they have of him being too ambitious was certainly a realistic fear, because he did actually overthrow the government. And he becomes the first consul. It's like the leader of France. And again, he is a genius military mastermind, and he's also ruthless and power-hungry tyrant. So during his leadership, Napoleon attacks Prussia, which is like Germany. He attacks Austria. Napoleon attacks Italy. Napoleon attacks Spain. And Napoleon attacks Russia. And so this creates the first French Empire. So, France grows from this to this. And most of Europe is under control of Napoleon. Okay, so in this time, it is customary for leaders of countries to give each other gifts. For example, before invading Spain, Napoleon gave the King of Spain a pair of pistols, decorative pistols. He also gave the king some fancy, expensive dresses for the ladies that are in the court. He gave the king fancy jewels. And he gave the king, the King of Spain gave Napoleon 16 horses from his best stables. But he also hired Jacques-Louis David to paint a portrait for Napoleon. Do you guys remember Jacques-Louis David? All right, he painted The Oath of the Horatii, The Death of Marat. And so he paints this picture of Napoleon. You might have seen this painting before. Have you seen this painting before? All right, it's one of those popular paintings. All right, it is an iconic equestrian painting. The story goes that while David was painting Napoleon for this, like during the process of painting, Napoleon refused to sit still for the painting. And David said, "How can I paint you if you won't sit still for me?" And Napoleon said, "It isn't the exactness or features, a wart of the nose, that gives the resemblance. Nobody knows that the portraits of great men actually resemble them. It is enough that their genius lives there." That's what Napoleon said. So he gave David the freedom to be creative. So he made this awe-inspiring, and uh, the wind blowing makes it more dramatic. Notice the calm expression on his face as the horse rears up. All right, and this is in the long line of the tradition of leaders having their portraits as they are on horseback. Do you remember what I told you that the horse is a symbol of? The horse is a symbol of the kingdom. So the guy on the horse is in control of the kingdom. He painted 5 copies of this portrait. He painted the original, and then 3 extra copies for Napoleon, and then he painted an extra one for himself. This image is not entirely accurate. It depicts Napoleon crossing the Alps with his army into Italy, which is a very heroic thing to do, but it didn't look like this at all. All right, this is very inaccurate, because you can see the army behind him, and you can see they are pulling the cannons up the narrow hill. Do you not see them? Let's get my pen, and we got right here are some guys carrying the cannon. We've got a couple other guys right here, and we got a guy over here, and there's this trail going up the mountain, and that's where they are all going. And Napoleon is right there with his troops, leading from the front, as all leaders should. That was entirely incorrect or inaccurate. He not only did not lead from the front, he led from the back. In fact, he followed his army a couple days after they crossed the Alps. So he wasn't with them at all. And also, he did not ride this magnificent stallion over the Alps with the wind blowing and the horse rearing up and so majestic and virile. He was riding a donkey led by a peasant. A very almost like an embarrassing mode of travel for an emperor, right? Okay. So Jacques Louis David becomes the main painter, or the painter for Napoleon. So let's take a look at a couple of his artworks. We're going to take a look at this one right here. Right. The Emperor Napoleon in a study. What's one thing you notice about this portrait? What odd thing do you see? Did I hear it? His hand, yeah. What's the deal with his hand? All right. In almost every portrait of Napoleon, he has his hand inside of his shirt. All right. So why? Why does Napoleon have his hand inside of his shirt? Because it's in image after image after image of Napoleon. Well, the answer is it's not just Napoleon, but just about everybody did it. You can see all these portraits. A guy has his hand inside of his jacket or his waistcoat. So the answer goes back to the ancient Greeks. Aeschines proclaimed that restricting the movement of your hand is the proper and dignified pose for speaking. And that's because when Aeschines spoke, he did not use wild gestures, but his nemesis did. Demosthenes was a rival of his, and he had wild hand gestures when he spoke. So Aeschines says only the dignified people don't use these wild hand gestures, thus insulting his nemesis, insulting his, I guess, his enemy. So that created this tradition of being very still is an expression of dignity. And even at the time of the portrait of Napoleon, there's this etiquette book for gentlemen, and it says the instructions for what to do while you're standing there in the green at the bottom is to put your hand inside your waistcoat. So that was a very common thing for men to do at this time. Also, what another bit of context going on, that Napoleon is in the middle of conquering Europe, and he's made a huge enemy of England. England hates him, and they make a lot of propaganda to insult Napoleon. That he was prone to fits of temper tantrums, so that he had wild gestures with his hands, and so Napoleon's portrait done by Jacques Louis David is very different than Napoleon images done by cartoonists in England, showing him as being a little tyrant. Also, they portrayed him as being short when the actual, I don't know if you ever heard of the Napoleon complex. Have you ever heard that term before? Right? That's when the idea that when men are very short, they overcompensate by being a little tyrant. And what that reminds me of is in, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Incredibles. When he worked at the insurance company, his boss was a very short man, but an absolute tyrant. All right, that's the Napoleon complex. All right, so moving on to the painting. He is dressed like the Imperial Guard. So the image on the right is an illustration of what the officers and the soldiers wore at that time. So he's dressed like a soldier. So you can almost imagine like a current president having himself his portrait painted while he's wearing army fatigues. So he's dressed like a soldier. The clock in the back says 4:17 in the morning. Why? Why would he have his portrait painted and the clock show 4:17 in the morning? What's the benefit? How does this make him look good? Yeah, he's up early. He's getting stuff done. All right, but there's a little bit more to it. Look at the candles in the background. All right, are those new candles or old candles? All right, how can you tell? Right, they're very short. They've been burning for a long time. That means he's been up all night. So not only is it early in the morning, but he hasn't slept yet. And then if you look down at the bottom, right, by his feet, there is a map, a military map. So he's been up all night planning his military conquests. On his other side, there is a sword resting on a chair, which is a reference to his military conquest. But the papers that are behind him, not only are there military maps, but it is the new laws that he has written. So not only is he planning military campaigns throughout the night, but he's also writing laws that will hopefully benefit everybody. But that is the propaganda that is oozing out of this portrait here. All right, speaking of propaganda, we're going to go to this painting right here. How big is this painting? Yeah, in Texas, we call that a big one. All right, and you can see by this photograph right here that the people painted in the photograph are pretty much life size. And this painting is 20 by 33 feet. All right, again, that's a big one. All right, so what is this a painting of? It's a painting of the coronation of Napoleon. So think about this. Why did France have a revolution? To get rid of what? Kings and queens and a monarchy, right? And to develop a democratic system of government. Napoleon gives himself the title of emperor. What's wrong with that? Right. That's the exact thing that they fought to get rid of. That's how egotistical this guy is. That he crowns himself the emperor. And look at this ceremony. This is the same kind of, I don't know if you watched the coronation of the king when King Charles became king. It was like this. They had this type of pomp and circumstance. And this is what they fought to get rid of, to have, this ordained by God kind of this attitude that the king is all powerful. And the other thing that happened in this, well, I'll talk about it in a second. All right, there were no coronations for emperor before this or after. So even like other empires that had emperors, they didn't do a coronation ceremony. So he's just making this stuff up just for himself. This uh, this ceremony was designed by Napoleon himself. The Pope didn't even want to be there either. The Pope is sitting right behind. This is the Pope right here. All right. But also, the Pope did not want to jeopardize his relationship to France. So he attended only to keep an open. It would have been an insult to Napoleon if he had not gone there. All right, the people in here have been identified. We'll go over a couple of the people. Like I said, that is the Pope sitting behind him. That is Napoleon holding the crown up. And in front of him, that is Josephine, his wife. The story goes is that the ceremony was supposed to be the Pope a priest putting the crown on top of Napoleon. But instead, he took that crown and placed it on his own head. And the message there is that you're not in charge, I'm in charge. So he's even breaking the tradition that he himself just started, or he's breaking the ceremony, the rules of the ceremony that he just made up. The amount of arrogance that happens here. Now, the drawing on the left is the original drawing that David did, and this is more accurate to what actually happened. Is that when Napoleon placed it on his head, that's what it looked like. Napoleon had him change it to holding up the crown in front of him because holding it over his head would look a little bit too arrogant. So Napoleon did indeed see that, what he did was actually a little bit too far. So he told David to, hey, take it back a little bit. Even though this whole painting, everything about this is too far. It's too arrogant. All right, on the far left are his brothers. And there's two brothers. The one on the far left did not attend the coronation because of in-family fighting with his brother Napoleon. There are his sisters that are right there. The mother is in the background. She was also not at the coronation because she is having fights with Napoleon. So it's not a happy family, but he has David paint them all there to make it look like they're a happy family, even though they were not even there. All right, again with the propaganda. And then he paints himself into the picture over here. Okay, our next artist is Ingres. It's spelled Ingres. It's pronounced Ingres, but I've also heard it pronounced Ang or Angre. So I just call him Anger. All right, he is another Napoleonic artist, and I love his work. He does such beautiful work, and so much of it is realistic. Like, look at the folds that are in the clothes or in the dress of that. What kind of a painting is this? Is this a still life? Is it a genre painting? Is it a landscape? It's a history painting, right? It's a history painting because it's very mythological, right? That's the, like, history paintings is about something that happened in history or the Bible or in mythology. Ingres wants to be a history painter, but here's one of his paintings of Napoleon. And tell me that's not arrogant right there. Yeah, he is posed like Jupiter. He's posed like a god. And the statue of Zeus at Olympia, like he has this classical pose right here, and that makes him look like he's immortal. All right, a couple other things about this. It's said to look like the Ghent altarpiece, where you have that round halo behind him looks a lot like the Ghent altarpiece. And this painting right here, this painting of Napoleon, is total propaganda. Ingres portrays Napoleon as the emperor of the French, but it also references Napoleon as a divine ruler. The furniture, the clothes, the setting all transform Napoleon from a mere mortal to a powerful god. The throne and the armrest is that of a god. And like I just mentioned, that round-backed throne is similar to the Ghent altarpiece. And then there are classical references in this. So there's a pilaster that is back there, and that's similar to Roman architecture that we saw in the Masaccio painting. On the carpet in front of Napoleon, there's an imperial eagle that appears on the rug. And then on the right, there's a cartouche. All right, what is a cartouche? This is a cartouche, this oval shape over here. And you can see it's the oval shape is right over here. All right, and then there are two images inside the cartouche as seen on the left-hand side of the rug. This one right here is the scales of justice. And then the one below it, this one right here, is a representation of Raphael's Madonna del Seggiola. All right, so he's referencing classical imagery in the carpet down below him. On the back wall over Napoleon's left is a partially visible heraldic shield. And there it is. And then this is an Italian symbol, not French. And the meaning is that this ties the Emperor Napoleon to the Papal States and Rome. He's not just French anymore, but he's total European. Like because he's conquered so much of it that it all belongs to him. Just Italy, France, all of it. And with his upper right hand, he grasps the scepter of Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was one of the rulers Napoleon most sought to emulate. And Charlemagne's name appears on the portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps. I already talked about this pose. It makes him look like a god. And then the jewel-encrusted coronation sword hangs from his left hip, and the sword is a symbol of his rulership. And it can be hardly seen because of the extravagant nature of Napoleon's coronation robes. Now, notice the white fur on this. This is the fur of an ermine. You remember an ermine from the Leonardo painting. And then the little black tails. You see the tip of the ermine has that black tip. So now you can count this. You can count all those little black tips and see how many ermines it took to make this collar or this robe for him. The Legion of Honor hangs from the emperor's shoulders, and a gilded laurel wreath is on his head, a classical symbol of victory. All right, so just the amount of arrogance that goes into these paintings of Napoleon is quite impressive. All right, and then we have this painting right here. Let's take a look at this painting by Anga. He did lots of portraits for income, but he hated portraits. Like I said, he wanted to be a history painter. But his patrons all wanted portraits. What amazes me about this painting, though, what's the most impressive thing to you? Yeah, right. The texture on that dress. It looks like silk, right? The way it shines, it's quite impressive. And then there's a sharp contrast between the clarity of the fabric with the softness of the skin. The proportions of the arms seem a little bit off, like there's no musculature or bones visible. It's not as rounded as it should be. And the proportions are idealized and not realistic. Like the neck is a little bit too long. The eyes a little bit too big. It almost looks like her eyes are going in two different directions. We're going to take a look at the Grand Odalisque. So let's take a closer look. All right, Odalisque is a woman in a harem. All right, so what is a harem? A harem is a room in the Arabic countries. It is a room for reserved for women in a family. So it is where the women or the wives hang out of a polygamous man. And you can see some of the Arabic kind of, or the, and I want to say the term Oriental. All right, so the term Oriental is we kind of think of it as being of like Chinese and the Orient, or the like the Western view of the Orient. Oriental means in art, it means everything east of Europe, and that includes the Middle East. This is a very foreign place to Europe at that time. And Europeans are quite fascinated with the Middle East. And you can see like the turban on her head, the fan in her hand, and some of the other, you can see a bit of a hookah in there. And you can see all these little parts of the Middle East in there. And that was a very popular thing at that time. Also, I don't know if I have it in my notes that her anatomy is a bit off. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, Anga was a student of David, and nudes have been a tradition since the ancient times. And so I talked about how Titian's Venus of Urbino is the beginning of the reclining nude in a painting. But even in the Renaissance, there's a return to classical nudes. And the rule is that nudes are distanced by time and not a contemporary figure. So nudes are like goddesses or people from long ago, and they are not people of today. And here we have like somebody of today, or the time that the painting was made. She is surrounded by lush satins, and I pointed out the peacock feathered fan and the turban. These are things from the Middle East. Like it's almost like a costume that she's put on. There's a nice compositional moment right here where the curve of the curtain and blends in with the curve of her hand and goes right up to the curve of her nose. It makes this nice U shape and guides the eye around. It's almost like her bones are like rubbery. There's no like the feet are a little bit small. The ear is a little bit small. Like there's all these weird and anatomical imperfections in this. So that's one of the things that's piqued people's interest in this painting. All right. So returning to Napoleon, like I said, he had conquered a lot of Europe, and he was a total badass on the battlefield. And he got a little bit too arrogant and decided to go and take Russia, and not really realizing just how insanely huge Russia is, and not really planning on how cold Russia gets in the winter. He thought that he could just march up to Moscow, conquer it, and bunker down in Moscow for the winter. But it took way too long to even to get to Moscow, and he got stuck in the horrible winters, one of the worst winters that Russia had, and his troops were totally unprepared for that sort of weather. They hadn't planned on being in Russia through the winter. So he went in with 400,000 troops, and then he came out of Russia with only 40,000 troops. So that means what, 90% died? All right. And most died from the cold, not from battles. And then that is when the rest of Europe began to see a weakness in Napoleon. So they all started fighting back. And after the defeat of Napoleon in Russia, the enemies of Russia, or the enemies of France, smelled blood and closed in on him. And he was eventually captured and sent into exile on the island of Elba, in which he escaped. And when he came back to England, or when he came back to the shore in Italy, his troops were there waiting for him. Remember, his troops, like he his troops into battle, and he had won so many times. His troops loved him because he was a military genius, and so he had a very strong following with his troops. So he was able to muster an army very quickly and go and try to do it all over again, conquer Europe all over again. But this time, Europe just wasn't having it. And so in Belgium, next to Waterloo, we had the last battle of Napoleon, where he was defeated by the British, and then he was exiled to St. Helena, which is halfway between Africa and South America. So there was no escaping for him. And he was under, you can see in the picture right there, he's under constant guard. All right, any questions about any of the artwork that we've looked at? That closes us for the Napoleon section of this chapter 27.